Okay, before I begin reading, I wanted to know a little bit more about Sherman Alexie. I learned he's an author, poet, screenwriter, and filmmaker. His genre was Native American literature. Since this is a nonfiction, I wanted to know a little bit more about his life. So I found out he grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation, and he lived there with his family. To look at the title, just based off the title, Superman and Me, I'm thinking he's comparing his life to maybe a comic book or wanting his life to be that. So I'm going to read the first paragraph. I learned to read with a Superman comic book. Simple enough, I suppose. I cannot recall which particular Superman comic book I read, nor can I remember which villain he fought in that issue. I cannot remember the plot nor the means by which I obtained the comic book. What I can remember is this. I was 3 years old, a Spokane Indian boy living with his family on the Spokane Indian Reservation in eastern Washington state. We were poor by most standards, but one of my parents usually managed to find some minimum wage job or another, which made us middle class by reservation standards. I had a brother and 3 sisters. We lived on a combination of irregular paychecks, hope, fear, and government surplus food. So at this time, I'm just thinking he didn't grow up with a lot, and he had to have had somebody who pushed him to read, or he found self-motivation. So I'm going to keep reading. My father, who is one of the few Indians who went to Catholic school on purpose, was an avid reader of Western spy thrillers, murder mysteries, gangster epics, basketball player biographies, and anything else he could find. He bought his book by the pound at Dutch's Pawn Shop, Goodwill, Salvation Army, and Value Village. When he had extra money, he bought new novels at supermarkets, convenience stores, and hospital gift shops. Our house was filled with books. They were stacked in crazy piles in the bathroom, bedrooms, and living room. In a fit of unemployment-inspired creative energy, my father built a set of bookshelves and so on filled them with a random assortment of books about the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, the Vietnam War, and the entire 23-book series of the Apache Westerns. My father loved books, and since I love my father with an aching devotion, I decided to love books as well. So at this point, I'm just getting that he really looked up to his father, wanted to be able to relate to him, so he picked up reading too. So moving on. I can remember picking up my father's books before I could read. The words themselves were mostly foreign, but I still remember the exact moment when I first understood, with a sudden clarity, the purpose of a paragraph. I didn't have the vocabulary to say paragraph, but I realized that a paragraph was a fence that held words. The words inside a paragraph worked together for a common purpose. They had specific reason for being inside the same fence. This knowledge delighted me. I began to think of everything in terms of paragraphs. Our reservation was a small paragraph within the United States. My family's house was a paragraph distinct from the other paragraphs of the Lebrettes to the north, the Fords to our south, and the tribal school to the west. Inside our house, each family member existed as a separate paragraph, but still had genetics and common experience to link us. Now, using this logic, I can see my changed family as an essay of 7 paragraphs. Mother, father, older brother, the deceased sister, my younger twin sisters, and our adopted little brother. So, I wrote SR to see the relationship between the boy and his family, and how he kind of got into reading just to kind of get away from the whole living situation, not living in middle class or high class. So, moving on. At the same time I was seeing the world in paragraphs, I also picked up that Superman comic book. Each panel, complete with picture, dialogue, and narrative, was a 3-dimensional paragraph. In one panel, Superman breaks through a door. His suit is red, blue, and yellow. The brown door shatters into many pieces. I look at the narrative above the picture. I cannot read the words, but I assume it tells me that Superman is breaking down the door. Aloud, I pretend to read the words and say, Superman is breaking down the door. Words, dialogue, also flowed out of Superman's mouth. Because he is breaking down the door, I assume he says, "I'm breaking down the door." Once again, I pretend to read the words and say aloud, "I am breaking down the door." In this way, I learn to read. So at this time, I find that really interesting that he taught himself how to read, and just by looking at pictures, he was able to figure out the words. So, this might be an interesting story all by itself. A little Indian boy teaches himself to read at an early age and advances quickly. He reads Grapes of Wrath in kindergarten when other children are struggling through Dick and Jane. If he'd been anything but an Indian boy living on the reservation, he might have been called a prodigy, but he is an Indian boy living on the reservation and is simply an oddity. He grows into a man who often speaks of his childhood in the third person, as if it will somehow dull the pain and make him sound more modest about his talents. So, just keep reading about his life. I'm learning that he was a smart child and that he may have been more. He might have gotten more of an education if he would have been in a higher class. So to keep going, a smart Indian is a dangerous person, widely feared and ridiculed by Indians and non-Indians alike. I fought with my classmates on a daily basis. They wanted me to stay quiet when the non-Indian teacher asked for answers, for volunteers, for help. We were Indian children who were expected to be stupid. Most lived up to those expectations inside the classroom, but subverted them on the outside. They struggled with basic reading in school, but could remember how to sing a few dozen powwow songs. They were monosyllabic in front of their non-Indian teachers, but could tell complicated stories and jokes at the dinner table. They submissively ducked their heads when confronted by a non-Indian adult, but would slug it out with the Indian bully who was 10 years older. As Indian children, we were expected to fail in the non-Indian world. Those who failed were ceremonially accepted by other Indians and appropriately pitied by non-Indians. So I'm just getting at this point that he didn't want to be like his other Indian classmates or people on the reservation. So he did read and educated himself. Even if it wasn't in the classroom, he did it at home. So I'm going to keep going. I refused to fail. I was smart. I was arrogant. I was lucky. I read books late into the night until I could barely keep my eyes open. I read books at recess, then during lunch, and in the few minutes left after I had finished my classroom assignments. I read books in the car when my family traveled to powwows or basketball games. In shopping malls, I ran to the bookstores and read bits and pieces of as many books as I could. I read the books my father brought home from the pawn shops in second hand. I read the books I borrowed from the library. I read the back of cereal boxes. I read newspaper. I read the bulletins posted on the walls of the school, the clinic, the tribal offices, the post office. I read junk mail. I read auto repair manuals. I read magazines. I read anything that had words and paragraphs. I read with equal parts joy and desperation. I loved those books. But I also knew that love had only one purpose. I was trying to save my life. So, obviously you can tell that he read so that he could be better than what his life was. He could actually make something out of himself, and he knew by reading that would help him. So to keep going. Despite all the books I read, I am still surprised I became a writer. I was going to be a pediatrician. These days, I write novels, short stories, and poems. I visit schools and teach creative writing to Indian kids. In all my years in the reservation school system, I was never taught how to write poetry, short stories, or novels. I was certainly never taught that Indians wrote poetry, short stories, and novels. Writing was something beyond Indians. I cannot recall a single time that a guest teacher visited the reservation. They must have been visiting teachers. Who were they? Where are they now? Do they exist? I visit the schools as often as possible. The Indian kids crowd the classroom. Many are writing their own poems, short stories, and novels. They have read my books. They have read many other books. They look at me with bright eyes and arrogant wonder. They are trying to save their lives. Then there are the sullen and already defeated Indian kids, who sit in the back rows and ignore me with theatrical precision. The pages of their notebooks are empty. They carry neither pencil nor pen. They stare out the window. They refuse and resist. Books, I say to them. Books, I say. I throw my weight against their locked doors. The door holds. I am smart. I am arrogant. I am lucky. I am trying to save lives. So what I get out of this story is that at a young age, he knew that by reading and getting educated that he would make it out of his poor lifestyle, and his father was a big inspiration in that, just by buying books for cheap or bringing them home for him. He was really self-motivated and learning that with self-motivation you can become anything, and he kind of at the end there becomes a comic book character with like kind of being Superman in a different way, with trying to motivate other Indian kids by bringing books to them, by visiting them, and being someone that he didn't have. So I find that really interesting. And that's it.